cognitive symptoms, problem with sleep, all of those things are affected. But that's when we look at that one individual. But vicariously, when we see that one individual affected, then all of us who witness that, who hear the story of that, who in the environment or the neighborhood of that, we're also affected.
Yes.
Because that affects how we perceive police. And for some of us, because of the situations that we've been in or the environment that we've been in, or even what we see on TV, we have this mixed signal. We see the police officer as this, I don't know if you guys had officer friendly here in Ohio, but we had officer friendly back in Virginia. Police officer who's supposed to serve and protect, who's supposed to be a help. We have that image. But then we have this other image, this image of a potential threat. And when we're in an environment where there's this image of a potential threat, that creates significant challenges in how we're able to disarm ourselves, how we have significant levels of hyperarousal, hyperreactivity, difficulty in being able to engage appropriately, sometimes with law enforcement, not just because of what we've experienced, but even vicariously through the experience that we've seen in other people. So it does a great deal of hurt and harm, not only to that individual, but also to the community that person resides, and to the group that person identifies.
That's a great point, because one of the things that we will hear by law, from police officers, is that when they pull over someone who may look suspicious, or they may have noticed what they deem to be suspicious behavior, or may have been notified of what someone perceived to be suspicious behavior. One of the things that often is said after that encounter by the police officer in regards to an African American who may have been pulled over by the police is that they noticed that they were uneasy or they were nervous.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting, because a law enforcement police officer may perceive that uneasiness or nervousness and try to connect it to them being suspicious or guilty of something, when in fact it's really a manifestation of the trauma they've experienced that makes them uneasy.
That's right. That's right.
And so, go ahead, Doctor.
Well, I was going to say, and in those circumstances, when we're pulled over by the police, many of us are in survival mode.
Yes.
Adrenaline is running, it's really rushing. We're, our cortisol levels are up, and those are circumstances which the body is saying, hey, we need to either fight or we need to run. And that is what the mode that our brain automatically goes into. Oftentimes we may be pulled over by police. So you're trying to rationally think through what my behavior should be. But my brain and my body is telling me something totally different. So that's a lot to manage in high pressure situations, when you're pulled over by the police, particularly being a person of color, knowing that you're more likely to have a greater risk of having a bad outcome in that engagement.
Once again, we have a few more viewers that are joining us now. You are listening to Dr. Quinton Moss, CEO of Modern Psychology and Wellness, as we look at today, trauma drama, Bad Boys in Blue.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, we're human, Dr. Moss.
Yeah.
And when we find ourselves in situations, it's easy to say, stay calm, stay relaxed.
Right.
But when you have in your present memory, in your recent memory, in the forefront of your mind, what could possibly happen if you move suddenly, if you say the wrong thing, that the situation could escalate rather than de-escalate. Are there I just might ask right now, are there any techniques or breathing techniques we could do? Because as an African American male, I would assume, because most African American males that I speak to admit that at some time they've been pulled over by the police for no reason, and they've gotten kind of nervous because they know it could go left pretty quickly. Not so much because of their reaction or just because what a police officer is assuming about them based on the demographic.
So there are things that we can do to kind of control our body. as I mentioned before, our body wants to go into this response of fight or flight. And one of the things that we all notice that we're doing when we're very anxious or very uptight is that we stop breathing. We hold our breath. So one of the things that we can do, if we can be mindful in that moment, is just to breathe. When I say breathe, I mean literally take a deep breath. Take a deep breath in and even let a longer breath out. And what that does, it helps the brain to reset itself. It tries to reset from this fight or flight down to a place where I can be more calm. And if I'm more calm, I can listen better. I can plan better. I can make sure that my actions are appropriate. If I can just take that one pause to just breathe. So that's the biggest thing that someone can do in that situation. When we hold our breath, again, we continue to accelerate that hyperreactive response, and our brain is not getting the oxygen that would be best. And we sometimes don't make the best decisions. So in any anxiety-provoking situation, that would be the best thing to do.
So is it conceivable that if someone has their knee on my neck and I'm struggling to breathe anyway because of all of the physiological things that are happening because of the trauma that I faced, that my ability to breathe or my difficulty in breathing is further exacerbated by the fact of the trauma that I've experienced?
That's right. So if someone has their foot on your neck, it's very difficult to respond to that in a calm demeanor. I mean, you're forcing your brain and your body into a fight or flight mode. And for the fact that someone can remain calm with unnecessary restraints on them or undue force on them is really a miracle. But again, being placed in those circumstances, provokes people, unfortunately, to respond in such a way that they feel like they have to defend themselves, which then creates this cycle. Now we've escalated, in which the police then feels they need to then escalate when perhaps their approach could have been different, which will allow for me to have a much better response, so that we both can get out of this interaction healthy and just being able to communicate what needs to be communicated in that discussion.
Yeah, because it's really hard. I mean, for transparency's sake, whenever I go to the doctor for whatever reason, I deal with that white coat syndrome. And I keep telling myself, relax, calm down. But invariably, when my blood pressure is taken, it's higher than after moments where I calm down. And I can tell myself, but just my natural reaction is, something's bad. I'm going to hear some bad news. And so similarly, when you're pulled over and you've got all that trauma and they're saying, don't resist, your natural reaction is to protect yourself.
That's right.
And especially if you feel that you've been unjustly detained, it's like, what's going on? And so, but you're still in those situations pressed down and pushed down, and you're supposed to have an out of body experience and act normally and just have total control of your emotions when you know what can go wrong.
One of the things that we teach our patients, particularly those people who suffered from trauma, is that when they're in an interaction that starts to become negative, that they start to communicate to the other person, hey, what you're saying or what you're doing is starting to make me feel uncomfortable. Okay. What you're saying and what you're doing is starting to make me feel very anxious or nervous. And what I've seen on a couple of these encounters that have come across, social media over the past couple of weeks is that we have an increasing number of Black men who are now communicating to the police officer, officer, sir, what you're doing is making me feel unsafe. Wow. That tone of voice is not making me feel comfortable. So that I'm being very clear to you that what you're doing is actually potentially escalating this event when it doesn't need to. So if I were to add something to the issue of breathing, I would add, communicate very clearly what the officer and their behavior, what they're creating within you. So perhaps it gives the opportunity for that police officer to adjust their approach, so that we can make this as an appropriate encounter as it can be under the circumstances.
And just think about how many lives could have been spared if we had been given that technique, and if the police officers had been trained in a way to help them to realize that though it's a part of their daily routine to pull people over, most people that are pulled over are not pulled over every day.
Right.
And, and what's normal for them is not a normal occurrence for them. They don't take into account what the person has gone through. They don't take into account. I've been saying, Dr. Moss, over the past couple of weeks, that who we are, the people we are, and the people we are becoming is based on the composite of experiences we've had in life.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever you've dealt with makes you who you are. So if I'm pulled over and I'm an African-American male and I have people that I can count on at least on two hands who have had poor interactions with the police, and they being law-abiding citizens,
Mm-hmm.
and I have that in my mind, so I have to struggle in terms of whether you're going to be friend or foe. And so when I think about just a long litany of people, when I think about Eric Gardner, Michael Brown,
Right.
Tamir Rice, Walter Scott. I mean, I'm just looking at the stories going on. Alton Sterling,
Mm-hmm.
Lando Castile. As I'm looking at these stories and right in front of me, Stephen Clark, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and recently Brother Jacob here. Those are before me, and I know how things can go wrong. But I want the police. We want the police to help us, because let's face it, as Christians, we are taught through the Word of God that God created government and that we are to follow government. But there's an interesting scripture found in Romans chapter 13, verses 3-5 from the Living Bible translation. And it reads, "For the policeman does not frighten people who are doing right, but those doing evil will always fear him." So if you don't want to be afraid, keep the laws and you will get along. When I read that verse, I add a caveat, and the caveat is for the policeman does not frighten people who are doing right. And most of the times when we interact with the police, we're doing right. Or if we're doing something that's wrong, it's not to the level where we should lose our lives.
Correct.
And so we are taught from the Bible, we are taught in society that the police are supposed to be obeyed, laws are supposed to be followed, but unfortunately, their behavior is, in a sense, they act as though they are above the law, and that is our challenge. And joining us now via phone is Paul Booth. Paul Booth is a former city councilman, son of a civil rights activist, Dr. L.V. Booth. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Pastor Phillips. Had a little technical difficulty, but finally made it.
Well, we're glad to have you. Paul, help us to understand historically and from your perspective, why it is so important for us to speak up, particularly those who are in a high-profile position and have an audience of many people, to say something about what's going on and as regards to police brutality and social injustice.
Well, number one, people respect you for that. And it is incumbent upon you as a leader to speak out, because you do have an audience. With that, people, they really need leadership. I was listening. I attended the march on Friday in Washington, and heard Al Sharpton say something that was very important, because they were expecting violence and so on and so forth. But because of the leadership, because of Al Sharpton's leadership, and the fact that he would, and the other leaders of NAN and the other leaders involved indicated from the beginning that violence was unacceptable. There was no violence. Mm-hmm. So leadership is important, and what a leader does is important. Mm-hmm. If you do not speak out, then silence is consent. That means you just go along. Mm-hmm. And Dr. King had several quotes about being silent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I was concerned about, and I appreciate the younger generation, the 20-something group, stepping up and being more vocal about what's going on. And certainly, when John Lewis, this was something that the late John Lewis was very encouraged about, and that there were so many young people taking interest in making sure that they were treated fairly by the police. But there's this pattern that we've been talking about that continues to happen. Doc Rivers said recently, he said, it's amazing why we keep loving this country and this country does not love us back. He said, it's really sad. He said, it's a bad thing. And so here is Doc Rivers saying, I should be a coach. I'm so often reminded of my color. Mm-hmm. It's just really sad. We got to do better, but we got to demand better. And I think that's where we are now. We are in the process of demanding better. Wouldn't you say, Paul?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And unfortunately, the tragedies that it has taken to
Paul, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. We're going to say it again. Go ahead. Repeat what you said.
So historically, if we go back to 1963, what got the world in attention in Birmingham was when they put fire hoses and they sicked dogs on men, women, and children during a very peaceful demonstration. So the nation embarrassed itself into taking a serious look at the cries and the pleas of the people.
So it's almost as though, and one of the things that in an undergraduate degree, one of our classes I love was called Black Political Thought. And one of the things that I realized is that sometimes people react more when there is a crisis. And one of the things I was concerned about is that the George Floyd incident happened, I'll be very frankly, too far from the election. I was concerned that the time between what happened to George Floyd and the election, there was too much time, and that people might lose the energy to change things around. And now here we have in Kenosha, here we go again. And so what would you say needs to happen, Paul, in keeping the momentum going and keeping the pedal down, the accelerator down, mashing us into change?
Well, I think that the peaceful demonstrations have to continue. I think we have to speak out firmly and fervently against the violence, because the violence and the looting that's going on takes away from the message. I think we've got to do that. Then we have to have the goals that have been set out for passing legislation primarily in Washington. Now, there are two pieces of legislation that the National Action Network is pushing for. One deals with the George Floyd bill that deals with policing. The other is the John Lewis voter rights bill. And so that those two go, because that's what's going to bring about lasting change. And we've got to also preach day in and day out to the young folks, the old folks, and anybody else to get out and vote.
Yes.
Get out and vote. We will soon be approaching the last day to register to vote, which is probably early October. But folks need to get out and vote. All of this stuff that's coming out of Washington, we got to tune that out about mail-in voting. Doesn't work and all that. You know, folks been mailing their ballots in for years, and there's no excuse for not voting. Because you can early vote, you can come to the polls. So there's absolutely no excuse for not voting. So we've got to encourage everybody that we know from our household on to get out there and vote.
Dr. Moss, in your practice and certainly in therapy, I hear doctors talking about this all the time, that some of their patients are non-compliant. They come in with a presenting problem. You, with your vast medical training, propose some solutions and some outcome,
right,
better their situation. And I'm hearing Paul speak as an elder statesman and civil rights activist, and he's essentially prescribing a simple thing that we need to go out and vote. How do we as a people take these type of prescriptions and take ownership in our part in being healed with the trauma as it relates to general trauma, but especially as it relates to police brutality?
Goodness, that's a very complicated question. But what I will say is this: you know, when we think about patients who come in and non-compliance, and we think about the presenting problems that our people have and whether we're going to comply and follow through, it is based on three things. You know, one, is there a sense of urgency? There's a sense of urgency, and I believe that there is now a sense of urgency. You know, the next time that we may have an opportunity like this, maybe 30 or 40 years from now, because the time prior to this where we had an opportunity was 40 years before, where we had all of America, well, a great deal of America, and white, black, very diverse group of people who are actually marching towards the same cause. And you don't get that window, that period of time very often. And now we have that available in this generation. So that's the question: is there a sense of urgency? What do I have to gain? And I think that's the question that many people are asking. What do I have to gain by me acting now to vote, for me to vote in a way that can create change for what I've been seeing? What do I have to gain from that? And I think that's a big question. But I do think the bigger question is even more is, what do we have to lose? And what we're seeing now is that our democracy is being chipped away. We've talked about voter suppression, very active in this political process. So we're now marching down this path where we could see our ability to vote, you know, restricted. So that's one thing we have to lose. And then the other thing that we have to lose is an ability as a people to have a voice. And if we are silent, you know, in regards to when these atrocities happen, we see that the powers that be will continue to allow these things to happen to us. It's a path where if I don't shout now, they're going to continue to poke me. If I don't shout again, they're going to poke me even more. And that's the path we're on. So those are the three things that we have to think about. If I'm going to comply or be compliant in exercising my vote, I'm not a political strategist by any means, but somehow we have to tie in this peaceful protest to vote. As many signs as I have about, you know, protesting systemic racism and brutality, I need to have an equal number of signs that say we need to go out there and start voting now. So
Right. Paul, you're next.
Looks like I'm in.
A little feedback, but yes.
Let me shut this. Hold on a second, man.
Okay, we'll let Paul get. But that's a great point. But it has to be in one of the strategies of voter suppression is to create a sense of hopelessness.
Right.
To say that it's not going to make a difference. Why? Because as Paul alluded to, there's no evidence of mail fraud. We've been doing it for ages because the mail's slow. But I'm going to let you know that it's really hopeless because I'm going to remove over 700 processing machines,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to slow down the mail, and then you're going to just feel defeated and say, you know what, it's not going to make a difference. I won't vote. Speak, Dr. Moss and Dr. And to Paul. I'm out of habit calling Paul pastor or preacher because that's really what I've seen him as for many years. He just ain't said yes yet. Okay, but speak to how do we override this sense through activism, Paul, hopelessness, and Dr. Moss override the spirit of hopelessness through our mental. You can start, Paul.
Yeah, I was going to ask Dr. Moss that question is from a mental professional perspective that deals with that. One of the things that we have to do, Trevor, Pastor Phillips, is that we've got to make sure that we are teaching our young people. And I could see where there would be hopelessness. There's the issue of unemployment. You've got this whole pandemic that has just transformed all of our lives. When you turn on the news, you've got craziness in Washington. You've got craziness locally among elected officials. And so it does raise the question with those who are not committed and who have not yet arrived at the importance of voting is that, my vote doesn't count.
Mm-hmm.
What good is it going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Ran into a young lady the other day that said that she doesn't like either. She doesn't like Biden or she doesn't like Trump. Well, you got to vote for somebody.
Right.
You got to vote for somebody. For you not to vote, I say it's really a vote for the other person that you really don't want. So we've got to make sure that we're teaching and that we've done our homework and that we pass that along to succeeding generations.
If I were to add to that, I think there's another issue that helps us to move beyond my vote doesn't count. And that is to stress what happens locally here in politics and government. When people understand that their vote for city council, when they vote for their trustee of their township, when they understand that their vote there over time does create change in regards to what happens nationally, people are able to appreciate the importance of their vote. And plus, they know that who I vote for trustee or for mayor or for city council, that directly affects my day to day. So if we can perhaps provide more education in regards to the importance of the local government involvement, and that helps people to see how their vote affects this locally, but it does transcend to even affect who we nominate for a party or who we may put up for a Senate seat. It does affect that.
Yeah, and the important that's an excellent point because all politics is local, as one of the politicians said. It's the other caveat to that is it's important who's in office. That person is making decisions about you and about your life on a daily basis. And of course, it begins in the hometown.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, we could not elect African-American judges because we didn't have persons running that were not qualified, but we just had a system that did not elect them. And it does make a difference for somebody who looks like you and me and who has been through the things that you and I have been through, that have an understanding, that have a mindset, that are making decisions about you, that whether it's a judge, whether it's city council, or whatever it is. So that local election is extremely important.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's very important that the people feel, again, empowered, and that young people feel as though they can make a difference. And the difference that they can make is not later, but now.
Mm-hmm.
And it is very true that silence in some circles means consent. And I love the strategies you proposed earlier. But the police officers are supposed to be trained, and you're right, Paul. It depends who is in position, because in office. Because if you have a person that is in office that does not believe in holding police officers accountable for criminal behavior, and who continues to flame divisiveness and racism and bigotry, it goes back to who's in office. And unfortunately, we as a people were asleep during the last election because we failed to see what might happen later on. And that's a problem that people have today in general, is that, we were taught that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And people don't see and understand Dr. Moss preventative medicine.
Yeah.
Don't understand the benefit of doing things to prevent further things from happening. And all it would have taken, Paul, in Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, for a few more people to have gone out and voted. And perhaps if the events that are happening today had been happening, they would have been handled differently, because there would have been a different person in office.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many elections that were so close.
Mm-hmm.
We've been told of elections one vote per precinct.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Would have made a difference. So
Mm-hmm.
and many elections are won by just a few votes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We have to continue to work and dispel that myth that I'm only one person, my vote doesn't count.
Right.
Because there's going to come a time when you're going to need that vote. You're going to come.
Absolutely.
You're going to come before city council.
Yeah.
Facing the deadline of the census. Folks they don't want to fill out the census forms.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a very low return rate here in the city of Cincinnati, something like 53%. So we're going to be pushing to have folks to fill out those 8 questions, I think it is, on the census form, and get that in, because that determines, the allocations of money, how things are done in your community. That something is local. That's something that we can all do. And recently, the government moved the date. You did have until October the 30th, I think, to fill out the form, and it's now September. After September 30th, that's it. We're done.
That's why I'm a proponent of moving the elections not back, as been proposed, ahead. That would be great.
Say that again.
We've been hearing, let's move the elections, delay the elections. I'm a proponent of moving them up.
Oh no, please don't delay them. We can't do that.
Yeah, Trump has been saying that, and I've been saying, let's have them tomorrow and see what happens.
And that's the thing about leadership, is the fact that he almost has a cult-like following.
Yes.
He gets a pass on everything that he does. So they're two different standards. It's amazing, and this is why it's important who we have in office, because the point of view is important. How folks can look at the same scene,
yes,
come out with a different scenario. There are people that are defending this officer that shot the gentleman 7 times. He should have complied. He should have done this. He should have done. okay, why does it take 7 times? The guy who was unarmed, but
Point blank range.
one person said that well, he had a 4,000-pound weapon, his car, but he was not in a position to run over that officer.
Here, you are absolutely right. But I will say this: I was in another forum called American the Ugly, which was hosted by Bishop Gary Hales, and one of the things we talked about is that we see the divide in the different viewpoints, even in the church. I would, if I were a betting person, I would suggest to you that most Black Christians, evangelicals, will vote for Biden, and most white evangelicals will vote for Trump. There are two Americas, there are two competing views. And what saddens me is, to your point, a Christian organization raised over $100,000 for the legal defense for the 17-year-old who shot the protesters.
Yeah.
And so the challenge is that we've got some things going on even in the Christendom to recognize what's right and what's wrong. And I believe it comes from perspective. And I believe that while we suffer from trauma, Dr. Moss, there's a vast majority of those in power suffer from separation anxiety, them being separated from their access and ability to control everything. Your thoughts?
I would agree with that. When people talk about, what is behind a great deal of racist thought and racist behavior, is fear. It's fear that I'm going to lose control. It's fear that somehow the resources that are available in this country, they're going to be taken over by another group, and I'm not going to be able to have that. If I would just piggyback on what you've mentioned about the church, I think the challenge with the church is that since the church has been a great deal of the foundation of this country, they talk about separation of church and state. They've always talked about that, but the church has been, one of the foundations of this country. But the church has now become a part of this nationalistic move, this nationalism. And so to be able to identify myself as a true American, part of what it is I have to be somehow ultra conservative or evangelical. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that I have very liberal interpretation of what my Second Amendment rights are, right? So that's another part of it. And then the third part of it is a nostalgia. There's a nostalgia for a period of time in which America, for white America, seemed to be on the boom. In the 1950s.
Yes.
Everyone wants to resemble going back to the 1950s in regards to pageantry, how we do our country, level of patriotism. But that is a time that for many other minority groups, could have been one of the worst times of existence. So church, guns, and this nostalgic patriotism in which they're losing, unfortunately, because our country is becoming more diverse and is changing. And I think that is part of the backlash that we're seeing, particularly after having an African-American president. So this is very complex in the sociology of what's happening with our country.
Yeah, Pastor Phillips, let me just get your thoughts on something, because you mentioned the white evangelicals and the Black church. What I find is that maybe we all do it to an extent that we put a spin on sin. In other words, the white evangelicals say that, because of the abortion issue, how can you vote for Biden because he believes in killing babies?
Right.
That's one of their hot issues. But it's like Reverend Sharpton said the other day that, you condemn the looting, but you condemn the shooting that's going on. How do we as African Americans, how do we sort of fight that sort of thinking, putting that sort of spin
Well, let me say, in Dr. Moss, for transparency, Paul is a deacon and father of a pastor. And for transparency, Dr. Moss is also a preacher.
Okay, all right. So I can feel that vibe. Yeah.
You got that. So one of the things that is we look at that if life begins at conception, then we have an emphasis to protect life in vitro. But what happens is the disconnect comes with the white church is that they forget that life continues after you're born. So there's an emphasis on taking care and preserving life while the child is in the womb. But unfortunately, that attention and desire to preserve and keep life and keep people safe outside of the womb is not given the same amount of attention.
Mm-hmm. That's that spin, yeah. Mm-hmm.
The spin comes from also the fact, for many people, that Black folk still don't measure up to them. In many people's eyes, we're still 3/5 of a person. And if I have a low opinion of a person, then it justifies my mistreatment of them, because after all, they're not on my level. And so because they're not on my level, then I have a license to mistreat them, or I'm justified in mistreating them because, they don't worship like me. They don't pray like me, or things that concern me don't concern them. So they use that. That's the spin I believe they use.
Well, the other thing is that we try to put, as I read it, all sin is sin.
Yes, sir.
Not one sin that is greater than another, and that's one of the other things these evangelical folks, in particular the white evangelicals. So they feel that they're almost looking at Trump as their savior, but they fail to look at themselves.
Right.
We know that when the woman was about to be stoned, because of her sin, that it said Jesus began, and you know the story better than I do, writing. He never even looked up.
That's right. That's right.
He began writing ground, and he challenged them that ye without sin cast the first stone.
Yes.
And they walked away. So that's what these guys need to look. They need to look. Michael Jackson said, "What? Look at the man in the mirror."
Right. But they're not willing. They're not willing to look at. First of all, they believe that social injustice is not scriptural.
Yeah.
And they understand that dealing with social injustice, we are justified in being able to deal with injustice. All you have to look back is when Pharaoh wanted to kill the firstborn, and he was commanding the midwives, we want to see who the firstborn is. You got to give them up, and they refused to do it. That was they said, we're not going to do that, right? We're going to hide, and that's how Moses went down the river, right? Remember the story. And so the Bible supports social injustice. The Bible says, Paul says, it's better to obey God than man. And so when it comes to doing the right thing, we have a biblical mandate. And so we can't, as you said, we can't put sins and categories and give greater weight to one sin because it's more convenient.
That's right. That's what we do. That's what's done.
Go ahead, Doctor.
Well, with the issue of abortion, it's very easy for us to unfortunately get a stance, whether white or black, pointing at those and get to be able to point a finger, to be able to say, I see what you did, I see what you've gone, I see what you've done, and to be able to identify that sin. That's very easy, I think, for people to do, and I think that's why abortion has become a lightning rod as it has. But I was having a conversation with my wife yesterday about, where would Jesus stand in the midst of the protest? And I was trying to think, where would Jesus stand? Now, truthfully, I don't know. But what I do know is that when he went to the temple,
Hmm.
and people were charging these people outrageous funds for these doves for sacrifices.
Yeah.
The oppressed people, they were making money off of them. They were manipulating them.
Mm-hmm.
And he went in there with a whip and started turning over tables.
Justified anger. Yeah.
Justified anger. So it speaks to me that I think that, when we think about protest, I think that we're justified in that, and I think that the scripture supports us standing up for those people who are oppressed, downtrodden, manipulated, those folks who are being squeezed from both sides. So I think that Jesus would have a very interesting position on the protests that we're seeing today. I think that many in the church would be very surprised.
Right. And I agree, but we've got to make sure that if we say that we are lovers of the truth, that we accept it all, even if the truth makes us uncomfortable, and puts us in a position where we must come to grips that some things in us must change. I said on the onset, because we're having a little technical difficulty, that not all police officers are bad.
Right.
In every segment of the population, in every profession, you have a few bad apples. And so a article featured by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in May of 2015, the author talked about what does good policing look like. And one of the things he said, it means partnership, being in cooperation between police and communities they serve. It means identifying with the community. A police department should resemble the community it serves in regards to race, ethnicity, gender, which allows it more easily gain trust and support of that community. And it talks about a modern use of force policy and bias-free policing and having independent external oversight. And I know because of the agreement in Cincinnati that there's an oversight committee. So when you hear those things, both of you, about how good policing is described, if you both had the opportunity to speak to a group of law enforcement individuals, what advice would you give them to encourage them to practice good policing? And from your own personal experience to you, what your definition of good policing looks like.
Well, I think what you have just read to us. What city was that? Was that
Pittsburgh Post-Gazette?
I think they've outlined it well that the police officer should reflect the community.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the old adage of treat others as you would want to be treated yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You would want somebody to be fair to you. You'd want somebody to be fair to your wife and to your family and all of that. Mm-hmm. You should not treat anybody else any differently. And what that points out is something that we talked about that earlier, is number one, who's in office and the policies that are laid down.
Yes.
Because the policies that are set should reflect the community, but they can only reflect the community if everyone has a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. When those policies are determined. I'm not one for the thing of defunding the police is sort of a misnomer. Obviously, we need police, and I don't think that a whole police department should suffer because of one or two bad apples. You got to get rid of those bad apples, or you try to eliminate them on the front end before they even become a part of the department. Do we need to examine policing for policy and determine whether or not we need to reallocate some of their funds? Yes, I agree with that. But when policing reflects that community, and then that community with a sense of humanity, police ought to have a sense of humanity. Most of the time when I speak to groups, particularly if they're African American men, I've asked the question: how many of you have been stopped by the police? 90% will raise their hand. I've been stopped. I had a police officer follow me all the way, pull in my driveway and follow me all the way to my garage. Because I guess he thought I didn't belong in that. So when I got out and I said, I made a mistake.
Right.
But I should have reported him. I did not. But, you know, and that's another thing we have to teach, is because we do have some officers with bad mindsets, and we don't want a situation to go bad and go downhill. And you have to realize, unfortunately, that officer does have some power against you over you when he stops you.
That's absolutely true. One of the lessons that my father would tell me all the time, who grew up in a segregated South, he said, listen, let me tell you something. If you find yourself, again, speaking to generational trauma, dealing with police, Dr. Moss, he said, if the police pull you over, shut your mouth.
Yeah.
Don't you say nothing.
Yeah.
Don't say nothing. And then later, we'll both go down there and handle it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that is not the time.
Yeah.
Say anything.
Mm-hmm.
Keep your mouth shut. And that stems, Dr. Moss, from generational trauma dealing with, because he has witnessed the police making, inaccurate and just lying in their reports and giving a different account. And he's been on the wrong end of that. And so if you had an opportunity, Dr. Moss, what would you tell a room full of law enforcement officers about what you believe as an African-American male, what good policing looks like?
I think that what you've described, from that article, that describes it very well. Well, I would like for us to take another viewpoint of this. As you mentioned, there predominantly most officers are doing what they're doing, and they're doing it well. They're committed to trying to protect and save lives and help people. But I will say that our officers are asked to do too much. So I have a firearm, and I'm trained to be able to assist someone with traffic. I'm trained to be able to do CPR. I'm trained to be able to go in and handle a domestic dispute. I'm trained to go in and manage someone who's psychotic. I'm trained to be able to help someone who's high off of fentanyl, who may have overdosed. I'm trained to do all these things, which speaks to, I think, that the responsibilities are too great. There's been a lot of talk about bringing in mental health professionals, a cadre of those people who can help police officers, who be able to help better manage some of these runs. Perhaps in instances where, officers are placed in something that's really beyond their scope, and in that situation, making some very poor decisions. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the mental health of police officers is also another big issue. We've talked about the trauma that the Black community suffers from bad policing, from profiling, from brutality. But each officer that we engage with, good or bad, also has experienced a great deal of trauma on the job. They would have 1 to 2 traumatic experiences over the course of a week. And so they're bringing that mindset, that predisposition also onto the job. So I also speak to making sure that they're taking care of themselves so that they can better take care of us. So those are some of the things that I'll also speak to. Yes, we have to do a better job in treating everyone as if they're a human being, treating everyone as if they're our brother, our mother, our uncle, or aunt, right? But also, we've, as a country, we've asked a lot of you. And there are certain things that are just not within your scope that we should have other professionals to ride alongside with you so that they can handle those things. So those are some of the thoughts that I have.
That's a good point. I was watching a story on one of the networks that had were interviewing the chief of police for Raleigh, North Carolina, which was an African-American female. And she alluded to that type of model where there wasn't the funding of the police, but there was additional dollars added. I don't even think there was a reduction in the force, but there was some money allocated for those particular situations that dealt with those interactions that dealt with whether it was a mental health issue. And you're absolutely right that the police do have they're called on to do a lot of things, and many things that they are doing, they're not trained.
That's right.
And so, but there needs to be an acceptance that they need to become educated about the people they serve. One of the last things I did in my undergrad at Ohio University is I served and I had an internship back in the 80s. I was a cultural awareness intern. And basically, it was an internship that I created mainly to make sure my grade point was higher. But we did it and I showed the police officers various videos about diversity, and I created some social forums which they could interact with international students, because some of the international students came from countries in which if you were arrested, you were going to get brutalized. And then as African Americans, we had our own story, But many of them in that police department, in Athens Police Department, didn't want me to be there. And when they were given an exam that I had prepared based on the video that they all watched, they were like, "We don't need this. We're fine." And I think that there's that culture, that mindset with many police officers exists today, that we are who we are and there's no need for us to change. And certainly that's come across even with the latest shooting, as the police union chief, not the police union chief, but the leader of the police union of that city has really backed the officer in saying that shooting was justified. We've had a great time tonight, and I really believe folks were really helped today, and I greatly appreciate you all, and I'm sure our viewers appreciate you as well. All those that have started watch parties, we thank you. Those that are watching primarily, we thank you. As we prepare to close, just ask you guys if you had any final thoughts that you wanted to give, and then we'll close.
I think my final thought is, we talked about, trauma and, generational trauma with policing and such in our community, but we didn't speak much about how we have to get those who are affected by trauma to get into mental health treatment. Our trauma rates are very similar to other groups, but how we engage in treatment and our outcomes and being able to recover from trauma are much, much worse than other groups. So if you are having symptoms or you're having challenges, getting into a mental health professional so you can get that addressed, so you can improve your mental health, but also your physical health and longevity.
Thank you. Paul,
good point. Yeah, yes, and I would just say my final thought would be to get involved, because there's something that we can all do. You don't have to have 5 or 6 degrees in order to get involved. There's something that you can do to make a change and to make a difference in your community, and then to pass that along to generations yet to come, and even generations yet unborn, so that they can be the change agents, and so they can continue to carry the torch and move things forward.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
It's been great, and we look forward to it. And for those of you who have been supporting us and watching us, stay tuned for our next installment of Mental Health Mondays. Stay well.
Gentlemen, have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.